in the quiet German town of Bonn, nestled beside the gentle flow of the River Rhine. A child was born in December of 1770. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven, a name that would one day echo through the grandest concert halls of the world. But his beginnings were far from grand. Ludwig entered a household marked by both music and hardship. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was a tenor in the court of the Elector of Cologne, a man who dreamed of transforming his young son into a musical prodigy. But where some fathers saw their children as a source of joy, Johann saw a chance for fame and fortune. From the moment Ludwig's small hands touched the clavier, he was plunged into a world of rigorous lessons, often accompanied by his father's sharp voice. Neighbors spoke of the boy practicing for hours, sometimes with tears in his eyes, sometimes late into the night. Yet in the midst of this stern training, a spark had ignited. Even as a child, Ludwig displayed a sensitivity to sound that was almost mystical. Notes seemed to flow through him, not as exercises, but as stories. By the age of 7, he was performing in public. At 12, he published his first composition, a modest collection of keyboard variations, but one that hinted at a soul teeming with ideas. His talent was noticed, and soon he studied under Christian Gottlob Neff, who introduced him to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. It was under Neff's guidance that young Beethoven grasped the divine logic of the fugue, a form he would one day wield like a thunderstorm. At 17, Ludwig traveled to Vienna, the dazzling heart of European music, to meet Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Legend whispers that Mozart, hearing Beethoven play, turned to those nearby and declared, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." But his time in Vienna was brief, cut short by his mother's failing health. He returned to Bonn to care for her, watching helplessly as illness claimed her. The loss struck him deeply, and the young composer grew more serious, his music reflecting a depth beyond his years. Finally, in 1792, at the age of 21, Beethoven returned to Vienna, this time to stay. He studied under Joseph Haydn, though their relationship was stormy, with Beethoven's fiery temperament clashing against the elder composer's methods. But Vienna embraced him. His piano performances were electric, a tempest of sound and emotion that left audiences stunned. His Opus 1 piano trios were a declaration of arrival, bold and confident. The next decade saw an explosion of creativity. Sonatas, quartets, and symphonies poured from his mind. His Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, until Beethoven furiously scratched out the dedication upon learning Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. Yet even as his fame soared, a shadow grew. His hearing, the very sense that defined him, began to fail. By his early 30s, he was nearly deaf. In the village of Heiligenstadt, Ludwig wrote a letter to his brothers, a confession of despair now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. He spoke of his isolation, his grief, and his thoughts of ending his life. But even in the depths of darkness, he chose to continue. "I will seize fate by the throat," he declared. And what followed was a torrent of genius. His Fifth Symphony thundered with fate's knocking, while the Moonlight Sonata whispered of love and longing. He crafted the Ninth Symphony while entirely deaf, its ode to joy a radiant shout of brotherhood and hope. At its premiere, he stood before the orchestra, unable to hear the thunderous applause until someone turned him to see the cheering crowd. Beethoven's final years were marked by struggle, illness, loneliness, and a world that could never fully understand the profound depths of his genius. Yet he composed works of stunning complexity, like his late string quartets, which seemed to speak not just to his time, but to eternity. On a stormy day in March of 1827, Beethoven passed away. Lightning is said to have cracked the sky as he breathed his last. More than 20,000 people followed his funeral procession in Vienna. His legacy is a towering mountain of sound, 9 symphonies, 32 piano sonatas, 16 string quartets, and countless other works. Though he could not hear his own music, the world hears it still, echoing across centuries. Through concert halls, whispered lullabies, and the beating hearts of all who dare to dream. In a small village near Warsaw, Poland, under the whispering skies of early spring in the year 1000, Ves Cyrillic letter 456, S Cyrillic letter 456, MS Ote Ya Teoge O, a delicate life took its first breath. Frédéric Francois Chopin was born to a world already vibrating with the sounds of music. His mother, Justina K.R. Zizanowska, played piano and sang with a voice that cradled dreams, while his father, Nicolas Chopin, a French émigré, taught at a respected Warsaw school. Their modest home was filled with melodies, both tender and vibrant, shaping the boy who would one day touch the soul of romantic music. From the very beginning, it was clear that young Frédéric was not an ordinary child. He was composing by the age of 7, his small hands dancing on the keys with a fluidity and grace that astonished all who heard. By the time he turned 8, he was performing in salons, charming the elite of Warsaw with his talent. People whispered that he was a second Mozart, but Chopin's music had a softness, an introspective quality that set it apart. Warsaw itself shaped him as much as his family did. The rhythms of the mazurkas, the poignant echoes of folk songs, and the sense of a nation striving for identity seeped into his spirit. These sounds wove through his compositions, and he carried them with him even after leaving Poland. At the Warsaw Conservatory, where he studied under Joseph Elsner, Chopin was not just another talented student. Elsner called him a genius, a soul uniquely attuned to the poetry of sound. In these years, Chopin honed his craft, blending classical structures with the folk motifs that reminded him of home. In 1000, Ves Cyrillic letter 456, S Cyrillic letter 456, MS Otete idetse ya te omu. At the age of 20, Chopin set out to Vienna, where his talent was recognized but not fully embraced. It was not the dazzling style of Liszt or the bold symphonic visions of his contemporaries. Chopin's music was more personal, more intimate, a single voice whispering amid the clamor of grandiosity. Soon he realized that to truly flourish, he needed a place where his poetic nature would be valued. Paris beckoned. Arriving in Paris was like stepping into the heart of a cultural storm. The salons were alive with conversation and innovation, and Chopin's arrival did not go unnoticed. He became part of the artistic elite, forming bonds with composers like Berlioz, Liszt, and Mendelssohn. Yet, unlike Liszt, who captivated vast concert halls, Chopin preferred the intimacy of a drawing room. His performances were subtle, his touch on the piano like a caress, drawing listeners into a world both fragile and profound. Amidst the glitter of Parisian society, Chopin met George Sand, the unconventional writer whose boldness fascinated him. Their relationship was a stormy blend of passion and conflict, with Chopin's delicate health often strained by the intensity of their lives. During their time together on the island of Majorca, his illness worsened, and the damp air seemed to suffocate his frail body. Yet, amid his suffering, he composed some of his most introspective works, including the Preludes, Opus 28, each piece a reflection of his turbulent emotions and deep melancholy. Despite his fame, Chopin was not a man of crowds or public adulation. He taught piano to the children of the wealthy, often finding solace in the quiet dedication of his students. His standards were unforgiving, demanding precision wrapped in emotion. It was never enough to play correctly. One had to play beautifully, with a soul bared to the music. His final years were a slow, painful decline. The tuberculosis that had haunted him for so long finally took its toll. His last performance in London was a testament to his dedication. A frail figure at the piano, his music flowing even as his body failed. On a quiet October evening in 1000, Ves Cyrillic letter 456, S Cyrillic letter 456, MS OTS OR OKEA de Yeveye Teoge O. At the age of 39, Chopin passed away, surrounded by those who loved him. In his final moments, the room was filled with music and candlelight, just as he had lived, surrounded by beauty and shadows. Chopin's legacy lives on not just in his compositions, but in the way his music resonates with human emotion. His works, from the poetic nocturnes to the patriotic polonaises, remind us of the fragility and strength within the human spirit. To hear Chopin is to feel the pulse of longing, the tenderness of love, and the quiet ache of loss, echoing through the centuries. In the shimmering maze of Venice, where canals lace through the city like silver threads and sunlight glimmers on waters cradling painted gondolas, a child was born who would set the world of music ablaze. His name was Antonio Lucio Vivaldi, but to many, he would forever be known as the Red Priest. His flame-red hair earned him this title, but it was his music that burned brighter, a cascade of passion, elegance, and storm. Vivaldi came into the world on the 4th of March, 1678, in this city of masks, mosaics, and murmuring waters. His father, Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, was a barber and a violinist at the great Basilica of San Marco. It was from him that Antonio inherited not just his fiery hair, but a fierce love for the violin. Venice, in that era, was a city of wonders and whispers, where the scent of incense mingled with the salt of the sea, and the echo of strings danced beneath painted ceilings. From an early age, young Antonio suffered from a constant tightness in his chest, likely asthma, a condition that would shadow him throughout his life. Yet this frailty did not dampen his spirit. At 15, he began training for the priesthood, a path chosen as much for family tradition as for faith. By the age of 25, he was ordained, but the sacred silence of the church soon gave way to a greater calling. Music flowed through his veins, and soon he was appointed as maestro di violino at the Ospedale della Pietà. The Ospedale was not just any orphanage. It was a bastion of musical excellence, a haven for young girls, many of whom were orphans or abandoned. Behind the latticed screens of the chapel, these girls became Vivaldi's muses, their angelic voices and skillful playing filling the air. Vivaldi wrote for them with a feverish passion, composing hundreds of works that showcased their talents. Concertos poured from his quill like spring rain, each one vivid, each one alive. It was here that his fame began to blossom. As the years turned, so did the tides of fortune. The young maestro composed at a relentless pace, violin concertos, sonatas, sacred works. But it was in the 1620s that he wrote his most famous work, The Four Seasons. These were not just music. They were portraits painted in sound. Spring arrived in a burst of bird song and babbling brooks. Summer trembled with the oppressive heat and distant thunder. Autumn danced with harvest festivals and swirling leaves, while winter bit with icy winds and crackling fires. Through these concertos, Vivaldi did not merely describe the world, he conjured it. Yet Vivaldi was never content with the silent stage. His passion drew him to the world of opera, a glittering realm of drama, envy, and grandeur. He composed nearly 50 operas, a staggering number, though many have been lost to time. His arias were like brushstrokes of emotion, fiery declarations, whispered promises, hearts laid bare. Venice's glittering theaters embraced him. But the world of opera was a tempestuous one, filled with rivalries and shifting tastes. The later years of his life were marked by a struggle for recognition. Once the toast of Venice, Vivaldi found himself out of fashion. The world craved new sounds, and younger composers rose to fame. He sold manuscripts to make ends meet, wandered to Vienna seeking patronage from Emperor Charles VI, a known admirer of his work. But fate was cruel. The emperor died suddenly in 1740, leaving Vivaldi without his last hope of support. Antonio Vivaldi died on the 28th of July, 1741, in Vienna, far from the glittering canals of his youth. He was buried in a pauper's grave, his once fiery star seemingly extinguished. His music lay dormant for over a century, forgotten, gathering dust in archives. But brilliance cannot remain buried forever. In the early 20th century, Scholars uncovered his manuscripts, and the world rediscovered his genius. Today, Vivaldi's music is everywhere. His four seasons sing in grand concert halls, drift through sunlit courtyards, and weave into the soundscapes of modern life. His melodies are not just heard, they are felt. They whisper, they soar, they thunder. They are Venice's sun on rippling waters, the dance of rain on ancient stone, the fire of a red-haired priest who painted the world with sound. In the warm, golden light of a late summer's evening, in a quiet town just beyond the bustling streets of Paris, a boy named Claude Debussy was born on August 22nd, 1862. His father was a modest shopkeeper, his mother a seamstress, and their home was filled not with crystal chandeliers or grand pianos, but with the scent of fabric and the soft murmur of conversation. Yet in this simple home, something extraordinary stirred. By the age of 7, Claude had already shown a touch of magic at the piano. Not the thunderous brilliance of a child prodigy, but something softer. A touch that seemed to whisper, to shimmer. His talent was undeniable, and soon enough, he found himself wandering the echoing halls of the Paris Conservatory, a place where genius was molded, but where young Debussy remained an odd soul, restless and curious. He was not one for rules. While his classmates followed strict forms and revered the towering symphonies of the German masters, Debussy found himself drawn to poetry, to paintings, to the gentle rustle of leaves, or the shimmer of moonlight on water. He was not simply learning to compose. He was searching for a way to paint with sound. In 1884, he won the prestigious Prix de Rome, a prize that sent him to Italy, where he was supposed to absorb the classical tradition. But instead of ancient rules, he absorbed sunlight on ancient walls, the laughter of Roman fountains, and the whispers of Renaissance art. He wandered through galleries, read poetry, and soaked in the world around him. And when he returned to Paris, he brought with him not the rigid techniques of the old masters, but a mind full of light, shadow, and sound. Paris was changing. Cafes brimmed with poets, painters, dreamers. Debussy was among them, a quiet observer with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. He was enchanted by the words of the symbolist poets, Baudelaire, Verlaine, Mallarmé, who spoke in whispers and images rather than clear stories. Their influence seeped into his music. His compositions did not march, they drifted. They did not declare, they shimmered. In 1890, he began sketching a small, delicate piano piece that would become one of his most famous works, Clair de Lune. Inspired by Verlaine's poetry, it was not a storm, not a dance, but a whisper, a moonlit reflection on a still lake. It seemed to float, unbound by strict form, and with it, Debussy's voice became unmistakable. His fame grew, though he was never one for crowds. He preferred the twilight, the quiet murmurs of friends, the soft rustle of leaves in a Parisian garden. But his music was not confined to the shadows. It bloomed. The shimmering orchestral magic of Prelude à l'après-midi d'un faun, inspired by Mallarmé's poem, wrapped listeners in a warm, dreamlike haze. His nocturnes painted skies, La Mer sculpted waves, and Pelléas et Mélisande, his only opera, was a forest of whispered secrets and moonlit paths. Debussy's personal life was as complex as his harmonies. He was charming but difficult, brilliant but capricious. His relationships were tangled. His heart wandered, leaving traces of joy and heartbreak. Yet in 1904, he married Emma Bardach, a woman of wit and beauty who gave him his only child, Claude Emma, whom he tenderly called Chouchou. For her, he composed the delicate, playful children's corner suite. As Europe stumbled toward war, Debussy's world began to darken. Illness shadowed him, colon cancer. Even as his body failed, his spirit clung to music. His final works, the 12 Etudes for piano, were a final whisper of brilliance, complex and clear as a winter sky. On March 25, 1918, as artillery echoed over Paris, Debussy passed away. His funeral was quiet, overshadowed by the chaos of the First World War. But Debussy's music never faded. It flows like a quiet stream, rippling through time, a breeze that stirs the soul. He did not write music for applause. He wrote for the soul's sigh, for the gentle flicker of a candle, for the shimmer of moonlight on a still lake. Sergei Rachmaninoff, a name that still echoes in the hearts of music lovers around the world, was born on April 1st, 1873, in a noble family estate near Novgorod, Russia. The family, once prosperous, had seen their wealth steadily vanish over the years. Sergei's father, charming but reckless, had gambled away their fortune and ultimately left the family. It was his mother who, recognizing her son's rare musical talent, enrolled him in the prestigious St. Petersburg Conservatory. Yet it wasn't until tragedy struck, with the death of his beloved sister, that Rachmaninoff's true musical potential began to blossom. As a teenager, Sergei transferred to the Moscow Conservatory, where he studied under strict but brilliant teachers. By the age of 17, he had already composed a one-act opera, a set of piano pieces, and a piano concerto. In 1892, he graduated with high honors, and his name was already spreading among the musical elite. That same year, he composed his famous Prelude in C minor, a thunderous and dramatic work that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Audiences adored it, demanding its performance everywhere Rachmaninoff went. But the piece became a source of frustration for him, as he grew to loathe playing it. However, it wasn't until 1897, when he premiered his first symphony, that Sergei's true heartbreak began. The critics tore it apart, and one review even suggested it had been composed under the influence of vodka. This devastation plunged Rachmaninoff into a deep depression. For years, he couldn't compose. His confidence shattered. He withdrew from the world, doubting his ability, and it seemed like he might never find his way again. It wasn't until he met Dr. Nikolai Dahl, a hypnotherapist, that Rachmaninoff found a path back to his music. With Dahl's help, he rediscovered his self-belief and began to compose again. In 1901, he returned with his second piano concerto, a sweeping, emotionally powerful masterpiece that is still adored to this day. The concerto, a triumph of redemption, solidified Rachmaninoff's place as one of the greatest composers of his time, though he would go on to compose many more works, including piano concertos, symphonies, and choral pieces. His personal life remained deeply intertwined with his music. Rachmaninoff married his cousin, Natalia, in a union that was controversial at the time, but remained strong and devoted. The couple had 2 daughters and lived a private life, largely away from the public eye. Sergei's music was deeply Russian, rich with melancholy and nostalgia, infused with folk influences and steeped in the country's soul. His performances as a pianist and conductor were renowned for their flawless technique and emotional depth. On stage, he rarely smiled, but when he played, his music sang with a power that could move even the hardest heart. Yet, the tides of history were about to change his life in ways he could not have imagined. In 1917, the Russian Revolution swept across the land, forever altering the country. Rachmaninoff, once a man of privilege who had conducted in imperial concert halls, found himself forced to flee his homeland, leaving behind almost everything. He and his family escaped to Scandinavia and eventually to the United States. In exile, Rachmaninoff stopped composing for nearly a decade. To support his family, he became a full-time concert pianist, touring relentlessly. Audiences adored him, but his heart ached for the Russia he had lost. Eventually, in the 1930s, he began composing again. His Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, written in 1934, became an instant classic, witty, lyrical, and breathtaking, with the 18th variation being regarded as pure magic. Though his compositions grew fewer in his later years, they shimmered with maturity. Works like his Third Symphony, composed in 1936, and his symphonic dances, written in 1940, reflected a man deeply reflective of a world that had slipped away. These pieces brimmed with nostalgia and longing, a connection to a Russia that was no more. Rachmaninoff settled in Beverly Hills, California, where he composed, entertained Hollywood stars, and tended to a rose garden. But his health began to decline, and cancer crept into his body. On March 28, 1943, just days before his 70th birthday, Sergei Rachmaninoff passed away. He was buried in New York, though his heart, his soul, and his music would always remain tied to the Russia he had left behind. Rachmaninoff was a man who lived through the clash of 2 worlds: the old Russia he had known, and the new, turbulent world that had emerged after the revolution. His music is a bridge between these worlds, a reflection of his inner turmoil and longing. It carries the echoes of a time long gone, a time of nobility, beauty, and a deep, almost tragic love for the homeland he could never fully return to. Today, his works continue to captivate and move us, each note a testament to a genius who lived with one foot in the past and one in the present, whose melodies can still crack open the deepest parts of the soul. Giacomo Puccini was the last great romantic composer, whose music was not just notes on a page, but the beating, breaking, soaring, and sobbing of hearts. His melodies captured the most tender emotions, turning farewells into arias and tragedy into beauty, all wrapped in sound so powerful it practically glowed. He was not only the final grand voice of Italian opera, but the embodiment of the raw emotional pulse of his time. Born on December 22nd, 1858, in the city of Lucca, Italy, Giacomo Antonio Domenico Michele Secondo Maria Puccini came from a long line of musicians. His family had been steeped in music for generations, with organists, composers, and conductors filling the Puccini household. It was practically expected that Giacomo would follow in their footsteps. But as a young boy, Giacomo was a bit of a troublemaker. He preferred pulling pranks, smoking cigarettes, and sipping wine over practicing scales. Music didn't capture him entirely, at least not yet. Then one day, something changed. At the age of 18, Puccini walked 18 miles to the city of Pisa to hear Verdi's Ada. That night, hearing the operatic grandeur of Verdi's work, his heart and soul caught fire. The young man who had once shrugged off the weight of musical discipline now dedicated himself entirely to his craft. He entered the Milan Conservatory in 1880 and threw himself into his studies. His music started to show promise. It was raw and intense, filled with the same passion and fire that would define his later work. His early operas were not instant successes. In 1884, his first opera, La Villa, premiered, but it wasn't a major hit. However, it garnered enough attention to keep his dream alive. His next works, Edgar and Manon Lescaut, helped to establish Puccini as an important new voice in the world of opera. His talent for capturing deep emotions, human struggles, and unspoken desires resonated strongly with audiences. But it wasn't until the creation of his famous trilogy that the world truly discovered the full scale of his genius. In 1896, Puccini wrote La Bohème, an opera that has since become one of the most beloved works in all of classical music. Set in Paris, it tells the story of four bohemian friends struggling with poverty, art, and love. The characters Mimi and Rodolfo fall in love in a story so pure, so heartbreaking. It touches the deepest corners of the human soul. A few years later, in 1898, Puccini wrote Tosca, a drama brimming with passion, jealousy, betrayal, and murder. The opera's tragic intensity set it apart as one of the most compelling works in the operatic repertoire. Finally, in 1904, Puccini created Madama Butterfly, a devastating tale of a Japanese geisha's love for an American officer. The aria Un bel die, where Butterfly sings about her hope for her lover's return, is so tender it seems to float in the air. Puccini's music was always rich with emotion. His characters leaped off the stage, vivid and full of life, making audiences laugh, cry, and gasp. But the man behind the music was not just a master of the stage. He was also a man of passions, both personal and professional. By the early 1900s, Puccini was rich and famous, living in a villa by the lake near Torre del Lago. There, he enjoyed hunting ducks, smoking cigars, and driving one of the first motorboats Italy had ever seen. His personal life, however, was more complicated. He married Elvira Gemignani, a fiery woman with a temper, and their marriage was filled with turbulence. A heartbreaking scandal involving the suicide of a servant girl cast a long shadow over their home. Despite the chaos of his personal life, Puccini found his solace in music. In 1910, he premiered La Fanciulla del West, a Wild West opera set in the rugged American frontier. It premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City to a breathless audience. Later came Il Trittico in 1917, a triptych of operas, each unique and filled with Puccini's signature mix of beauty and melancholy. One of the most famous arias, O mio babbino caro, came from Gianni Schicchi, a comic opera in which Puccini displayed his lighter, more humorous side. But it was his final opera, Turandot, that stands as his crowning achievement. It tells the story of an icy princess who sets impossible riddles for her suitors, with the penalty for failure being death. The aria Nessun Dorma, sung by the heroic Caliph as he attempts to win Turandot's heart, has become one of the most iconic pieces in all of opera. Tragically, Puccini never lived to see the completion of Turandot. In 1924, while working on the final scene, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He traveled to Brussels for experimental treatment, but his health deteriorated rapidly. On November 29, 1924, Puccini passed away. The premiere of Turandot was conducted by Arturo Toscanini, and when they reached the point where Puccini had stopped writing, Toscanini stopped the orchestra and said, "Here the maestro laid down his pen." The audience wept as the reality of the loss sank in. Puccini gave the world melodies that shimmered with emotion. He brought opera into the 20th century with unmatched style, soul, and a sound that still echoes today. When a soprano belts Vissi Dart from Tosca, or a tenor cries out Nessun Dorma from Turandot, Puccini is there in spirit, grinning beneath his mustache, knowing that his music has left an indelible mark on the world. So tonight, as you drift into dreams, imagine the quiet before the aria begins, the flicker of candlelight in a gilded theater, and a voice rising into the air, breaking your heart in the most beautiful way. In the Baroque city of Salzburg, on a freezing January night in 1756, a tiny, wailing miracle entered the world. His name was Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart, though history would come to know him simply as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Born into a home where music was as constant as the air, his fate seemed written before he could even speak. Wolfgang's father, Leopold Mozart, was a respected composer and violinist in the service of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. He was a strict but devoted father, and when he saw his young son's natural gift for music, he became both his teacher and his promoter. Before Wolfgang could write words, he was reading music. At 3, he was picking out melodies on the clavier. and by 5, he was composing short pieces that dazzled anyone who heard them. Alongside his sister, Maria Anna, known as Nannerl, who was also a talented musician. Young Wolfgang's childhood was a whirlwind of sound and travel. Leopold, ever ambitious for his son, took the family on a grand tour of Europe. In Paris, they played for nobility in London, for King George III. The boy was more than a novelty. He was a revelation. Composers marveled at his skill, and audiences whispered that they were witnessing something divine. But beneath the powdered wigs and glittering chandeliers, there was a serious artist taking shape. Young Mozart absorbed the styles and forms he encountered, transforming them, blending them into something that was unmistakably his own. Yet for all the applause, the family's life was far from easy. Constant travel meant constant strain, and Wolfgang, despite his fame, was still a child, longing for play, for friends, for a home. As a young man, he returned to Salzburg, working under the patronage of the Prince Archbishop, but he chafed at the restrictions of court life. His spirit was too restless, his creativity too vast to be confined. After a failed romance with singer Aloysia Weber, he married her sister Constance, a woman who would stand by him through joy and hardship alike. In 1781, Mozart made a bold choice. He left Salzburg and moved to Vienna, determined to make his own way as a freelance composer. The years that followed were a whirlwind of creation. His music ranged from light-hearted serenades to grand symphonies, from joyful operas like The Marriage of Figaro to the dark, dramatic power of Don Giovanni. His work was admired, imitated, but not always well paid. For all his genius, Mozart struggled financially, living a life of creative riches but material insecurity. In 1791, a strange commission arrived, an anonymous request for a requiem mass. The mystery and the somber nature of the piece consumed Mozart. His health was failing, yet he worked feverishly, convinced he was writing his own funeral music. And in a way, he was. On December 5th of that same year, at the age of 35, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart passed away, leaving the Requiem unfinished, a haunting masterpiece completed by his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr. Mozart's life was brief, but his legacy was vast. Over 600 compositions, symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music, each one a spark of brilliance. He had transformed the world of music, bringing to it joy, sorrow, laughter, and grandeur. Today, his melodies are everywhere, in grand concert halls, in lullabies, in films, and in the hearts of millions. He was a man who seemed to compose with the voice of angels and the wit of a child, leaving behind not just notes on a page, but a treasure of sound that continues to fill the world with wonder. In the quiet town of Aachen, Germany, in the spring of 1685, a boy was born who would become the very heartbeat of the Baroque era. His name was Johann Sebastian Bach. He arrived into a world where music was not a luxury, but a necessity, woven into the very fabric of life. His father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, a well-regarded musician in the town, and his mother, Elizabeth Lemmert, surely sang lullabies that carried the promise of destiny. The Bach family was to music what the Von Trapp family was to singing, with nearly every male member being a musician. In fact, in some German towns, the name Bach alone was synonymous with music. When Johann was just 10 years old, fate took a harsh turn. Both of his parents passed away within months of each other. Orphaned but not alone, Johann moved in with his older brother, Johann Christoph Bach, who was an organist. It was here that Johann's world expanded, for he found himself surrounded by an extraordinary library of music. His nights became an immersion into the works of great composers. By candlelight, he secretly copied forbidden compositions, honing his skills. His hands grew calloused from playing. His eyes strained from hours of reading music, but his soul glowed ever brighter with the fire of artistic ambition. At a young age, Bach began making his own mark in the world. He took a post as an organist in the town of Arnstadt, where his playing was unlike anything the community had heard before. His dazzling organ runs, daring harmonies, and intricate ornamentation shocked the congregation and bewildered his superiors. But Johann didn't care for their disapproval. Driven by a thirst for knowledge, he walked a grueling 250 miles to hear the famous organist Dietrich Buxtehude perform in Lübeck. He stayed so long that he overstayed his leave by months. When he finally returned, he was reprimanded, but none of that could dampen his excitement. The experience had opened his mind to the divine possibilities of music, and his compositions began to flourish. Bach's personal life was marked by both joy and profound sorrow. He married his cousin, Maria Barbara Bach, and together they had 7 children, though tragically 4 of them died in infancy. Amid the sadness, Bach poured his heart into his music, creating some of his most powerful early cantatas. He moved to the town of Weimar, where he became the court organist and concertmaster. It was here that some of his most iconic works began to take form. The magnificent toccata and fugue in D minor, the Brandenburg Concerto, and the first sketches of what would later become his well-tempered clavier. In one of the most tragic chapters of his life, Maria Barbara died suddenly in 1720. When Bach returned home, he found his wife already buried, and the loss struck him deeply. Yet, even in his grief, he poured his sorrow into music. A year later, he married Anna Magdalena Wilk, a talented soprano whose voice was as bright as silver. Together, they had 13 children, and Anna became his partner both in life and in composition. In 1723, Bach took the position of cantor at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, where he would spend the rest of his life. It was here, amid the daily demands of composing for Sunday services, managing choirs, teaching Latin, and wrangling students, that he created an extraordinary body of sacred music. Hundreds of cantatas, the St. John Passion, and the monumental St. Matthew Passion, which many consider the pinnacle of spiritual music, were born from this period of intense creativity. the Mass in B minor, a towering work that merged theology with emotion, was pieced together over several decades and was never performed in full during his lifetime. Yet today, it is recognized as one of the greatest achievements in Western music. As Bach grew older, his health declined. He eventually went blind, likely as a result of poorly executed eye surgeries. But even in the face of physical blindness, his mind remained sharp. He continued to dictate his final works to his son-in-law, one of which was the Art of Fugue, an unfinished but awe-inspiring masterpiece of counterpoint. The work's complexity is such that it can make one's soul weep and one's mind overheat with the sheer intricacy of its design. Johann Sebastian Bach passed away in 1750, at the age of 65 in Leipzig. His death was met with little fanfare. His style had fallen out of fashion, too ornate, too serious, too baroque. For nearly a century, his music was largely forgotten. But Bach's genius never faded entirely. In the early 19th century, composer Felix Mendelssohn revived the scent, Matthew Passion, sparking a renewed interest in Bach's work. This resurgence ignited a renaissance of Bach's music, and today he is rightly revered as the father of Western music. Bach's influence is profound, touching the work of nearly every composer who followed, from Beethoven to the Beatles. His fugues are studied, performed, and loved worldwide, and his music continues to teach discipline, inspire joy, and invite us to touch the divine. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine a cathedral bathed in golden light, with each note of Bach's organ whispering up into the rafters, complex and devout, eternal and unforgettable. In the spring chill of May, in the year 1840, a child was born in the small industrial town of Votkinsk, far from the grand theaters of Europe. This child, with a soul tuned to music and a heart too tender for the world's sharp edges, was Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. His father, Ilya, a mining engineer, was a stern but caring man, while his mother, Alexandra, a gentle woman of French descent, filled their home with the soft murmur of lullabies. Little Pyotr was a sensitive boy, one whose emotions were always just beneath the surface. At the age of 5, he touched the piano for the first time, and the keys seemed to respond to his fingers like an old friend. By the age of 7, he read music as easily as words, and yet his gift was not met with open arms. The world around him expected something practical from him, a stable career, a reliable income. And so, at the age of 10, he was sent to the Imperial School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg, a place of rigid discipline and cold formality. For a boy who spoke with notes instead of words, it was a prison of quiet suffering. Yet even there, in the shadow of cold legal texts and severe instructors, music found him. He would sneak away to play the piano, his soul pouring out through melodies that only the empty rooms could hear. After graduation, he took a government job as expected, but his heart was a caged bird, its wings beating against the bars of routine. In 1862, against the expectations of his family and society. Tchaikovsky turned his back on the law and embraced music. He enrolled in the newly established St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he studied under the great Anton Rubinstein. There his talent blossomed, his compositions rough but radiant with feeling. Emotion for Tchaikovsky was not just an element of music, it was its very essence. By 1866, he was in Moscow, teaching at the Moscow Conservatory, mentored by Nikolai Rubinstein, Anton's brother. His first symphony, Winter Daydreams, whispered of snow-covered forests and quiet, aching beauty. Yet beneath his rising success was a heart that could not find peace. Tchaikovsky struggled with profound loneliness, self-doubt, and a secret he could never share openly. He was a gay man in a society where such a truth was a dangerous burden. Still, he wrote, his music became a mirror of his soul, passionate, sorrowful, and often storm-tossed. In 1877, seeking some kind of refuge from his turmoil, he married Antonina Milyukova, a woman he barely knew. It was a desperate attempt to conform, to bury his true self beneath the facade of normalcy. But the marriage was a disaster. Within weeks he fled, his mind shattered, his spirit drowning in despair. It was during this darkness that he composed his Fourth Symphony, a work of raw emotion, where the strings weep and fate seems to knock at the door. Yet even in his darkest hours, a light appeared, Nadja von Meck, a wealthy widow who adored his music and offered him financial support so he could compose freely. For 13 years, they exchanged hundreds of letters, tender, philosophical, sometimes desperate. She was his confidant, his invisible muse. But they never met. During these years, Tchaikovsky composed his most beloved works, the Romeo and Juliet Overture, where love sings and dies in a heartbeat, the Violin Concerto, once considered unplayable but now a masterpiece, and of course his ballets, Swan Lake, a tale of doomed love beneath the moonlit lake, Sleeping Beauty, a vision of regal splendor, and the Nutcracker, a magical dreamland that would become a Christmas tradition around the world. In 1893, he completed his Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique, a work of such deep sorrow and beauty that it seemed like a farewell. 9 days after its premiere, Tchaikovsky was dead. Officially, it was said he died of cholera, but whispers spoke of something darker, despair, perhaps even suicide. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's music is a mirror for every storm, a sunrise for every tear. He showed the world that beauty could be fragile, that strength could be tender, that music could speak when words could not. His soul, wounded and yearning, found a voice in his compositions, and through them it still speaks. His notes linger, a bittersweet whisper carried on the wind. In the misty alleys of Hamburg, beneath the gray northern skies, where seagulls called and ship masts creaked like ancient trees, a boy was born whose music would one day weave joy and sorrow into a single strand. Johannes Brahms came into the world on the 7th of May, 1833. to a family where music was both a blessing and a necessity. His father, Johann Jakob Brahms, played the double bass in taverns and dance halls, smoky, bustling places where laughter was loud, and the scent of ale mixed with sea breeze. His mother, Johanna, was a woman of quiet strength, 20 years older than her husband, but steady as a lighthouse, holding the family together. Little Johannes was a serious child, with wide blue eyes that seemed to drink in the world. He began piano lessons at the age of 7, and even then, his touch on the keys was gentle but sure. By his early teens, he was already earning money for his family, playing in the very same rough taverns where his father worked. These were places of thick smoke, rolling laughter, and brawny sailors. Yet here, among the chaos, Brahms learned resilience. He played to survive, but even in those wild halls, his melodies carried a strange, aching beauty. It was in 1853, at the age of 20, that Brahms' life took a turn that seemed like fate itself. He met the great violinist Joseph Joachim, who, awed by Brahms' talent, gave him a letter of introduction to Robert and Clara Schumann. Robert, a composer and critic, was so enchanted by Brahms' talent that he wrote a public letter, calling him the future of music. For young Johannes, it was a blessing and a burden. The world now had expectations, and Brahms was determined not to disappoint. Clara Schumann became more than just a friend. She was a muse, an anchor, a confidant. With her dark, intelligent eyes and soul that seemed to understand his every unspoken word, Clara was the light and shadow of his life. They wrote letters, endless letters, that spoke of music, life, hope, and longing. Brahms loved her deeply, but it was a love forever unfulfilled, a love that hovered between devotion and distance. As his fame grew, Brahms became known as a man of contradictions. He adored the classical forms of Beethoven and Bach, yet his music pulsed with a new, unrestrained emotion. He could be gruff and sarcastic, yet under the surface was a soul that felt too deeply. His first symphony took him over a decade to complete. He feared it would be compared to Beethoven's Ninth, and for years the weight of expectation crushed him. But when it finally premiered in 1876, it was a triumph, a work of storm and sunlight, of struggle and victory. Vienna became his second home. He wandered its streets, beard flowing, coat billowing in the wind, a familiar figure in the coffee houses where he would scribble notes on napkins or simply feed the pigeons. He was generous to young musicians, often giving money anonymously. And though he could be grumpy, those who knew him well saw the kindness beneath the brusque exterior. But it was Clara's death in 1896 that shattered him. He visited her often in her final days, sitting by her bed in silence or playing the piano softly, his fingers trembling. When she was gone, a part of him seemed to leave with her. He lived only one more year, his music growing quieter, more introspective. On the 3rd of April, 1897, Brahms passed away, leaving behind a world richer for his melodies. Johannes Brahms was not a revolutionary. He did not shatter musical forms. Instead, he polished them until they gleamed, filling them with his own stormy heart. His music is a gentle hand on a grieving shoulder, a whispered promise in the dark, a smile with tears in its eyes. He did not need to shout. He simply spoke, and the world still listens. Thunder, not the distant rumble of a passing storm, but a primal, earth-shaking roar, a sound that seemed to split the heavens. This was the world of Richard Wagner, a world where gods clashed, heroes rose, and entire civilizations crumbled to the call of horns and the crash of cymbals. His music didn't merely play, it conquered. Richard Wagner was born on the 22nd of May, 1813, in Leipzig, a city caught in the aftershocks of Napoleonic Wars. His childhood was a theater of change and mystery. His father, Carl Friedrich Wagner, died when Richard was just 6 months old. His mother soon remarried Ludwig Jayer, an actor, painter, and playwright, who may have been his true father. A whisper of scandal that would echo through his life. Young Richard was dramatic from the start. He didn't simply enter rooms, he stormed into them. While other children played, he imagined grand tragedies, his mind a stage of epic conflicts. He began composing in his teens, but even then, it was clear Wagner wasn't interested in following musical rules. He wanted to rewrite them. His early career was a struggle. His first operas, Die Feen and Rienzi, were met with lukewarm applause. But then came Der Fliegende Holländer, the Flying Dutchman, in 1843. A tale of a cursed sea captain doomed to sail forever. It was fierce, shadowed by stormy orchestration and haunted choirs. Suddenly, Wagner's voice was undeniable, and that voice would only grow louder. Tannhäuser and Lohengrin followed, operas where knights and lovers fought for redemption beneath soaring choruses. But Wagner was more than a composer. He was a political rebel. In 1849, he joined the Dresden Uprising, a failed revolution that saw him branded an outlaw. Forced into exile, he fled to Switzerland. It was in this quiet isolation that Wagner began his most ambitious creation, Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelung, a massive four-opera saga drawn from ancient Germanic and Norse mythology. Gods, giants, dragons, a world of betrayal, love, and doom. It was more than music. It was myth. For 26 years, he labored over the cycle, perfecting every note. And then, in 1876, he unveiled it in a theater of his own design, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. No royal boxes, no social hierarchy, just an audience plunged into darkness, lost in the world he had summoned. Wagner's personal life was as tempestuous as his music. He married Minna Planer, a singer, but the marriage was a storm of infidelity and conflict. Later he fell for Cosima, daughter of Franz Liszt and wife of his own friend Hans von Bülow. Cosima left her husband, married Wagner, and became his most devoted ally. Yet even amidst the chaos of his life, his music soared. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, a young, dream-struck monarch, became his patron. showering him with funds and building his theater. Ludwig saw in Wagner's work a mirror of his own grand, impossible dreams. Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, premiered in 1882. Mystical, luminous, a tale of suffering and redemption, it whispered where his earlier works had thundered. But Wagner's own end was near. On February 13th, 1883, he died of a heart attack in Venice. His body was brought back to Bayreuth, buried in the garden of the Villa Wanfried, his final home. But his music did not die with him. It thundered on across Europe, across the world. His operas redefined drama, his lacing of music and story a template for generations. In the soaring brass of a movie score, in the shadow of every hero's journey, Wagner's voice still echoes. Close your eyes tonight and hear it. The thunder of gods, the clash of heroes, the whisper of redemption. This was Richard Wagner, not just a composer, but a storm given human form. In the gentle hush of Vienna, where cobbled streets whispered with carriage wheels and candlelight flickered against velvet curtains, Franz Peter Schubert first opened his eyes on a cold winter morning, the 31st of January, 1797. His family's modest home in Himmelpfortgrund was filled with the constant hum of life. His father, a diligent schoolteacher, his mother, a quiet and kind homemaker, and a flock of siblings, each with their own mischief. But in the midst of this bustling simplicity, young France was different. His world was one of melodies. From the start, France seemed woven from softer threads. He was a shy, bespectacled boy, with a gentle voice and a gaze that seemed to look beyond walls and words. He learned the violin from his father and the piano from his older brother Ignaz. But even in those early lessons, something shimmered in his touch, a delicate poetry that whispered through the keys. His family quickly saw it. This boy was a musician, not just by skill, but by soul. At 11, he won a scholarship to the Imperial Seminary in Vienna, a sacred fortress of music where his talents were soon recognized. Among his teachers was Antonio Salieri, the very man once painted as Mozart's rival. But to young France, Salieri was not a villain. He was a mentor, a man who saw the light in the boy's soul and nurtured it with gentle guidance. Under Salieri's watchful eye, France's gift blossomed. Yet genius is not always a ticket to glory. For Schubert, it meant an insatiable urge to write. And write he did, songs, symphonies, quartets, operas, piano sonatas, all pouring out of him as though his very heart played the notes. But while his pen danced, his name did not. Unlike the grand composers of his age, Schubert's music was often confined to smoky apartments, whispered in salons among friends rather than celebrated on gilded stages. These gatherings became known as Schubertshades, magical evenings where poets, painters, and dreamers would gather, the air thick with wine, poetry, and the soft glow of candlelight. In these intimate circles, his music found its first breath, his voice a soft, glowing ember among the chatter and laughter. His songs, Lieder, were not just music. They were emotional landscapes, In Gretchen am Spinnrad, the piano spun a wheel of longing and despair. In Erlkönig, the keys galloped in terror, while the voice shifted between the desperate father, the terrified child, and the ghostly king of the forest. And in Ave Maria, he wrote a prayer that seemed to float like incense, delicate, eternal. Schubert's life was a quiet race against time. As his talent soared, his health crumbled. He fell ill, likely from syphilis, a shadow that darkened his days. But even as his body weakened, his creativity burned with desperate brilliance. His last years were a fevered dream of composition. The towering string quintet in C major, his final 3 piano sonatas, each filled with a luminous glow, shadowed by sorrow. On the 19th of November, 1828, at just 31 years old, Franz Schubert slipped away quietly. A candle burned to its base. His body was laid to rest near Beethoven, his idol, a silent testament to a light the world had barely begun to notice. But time has a way of uncovering buried treasures. Today, Schubert's music is sung in grand halls and whispered in quiet rooms. His lieder are performed with reverence, his symphonies shimmer, and his name stands among the giants. He was the poet of tender hearts, the voice of quiet fires. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let his melodies drift around you. Feel the soft ache of lost loves, the gentle hum of spinning wheels, the whispered prayers that float like stars. Franz Schubert, the quiet fire that never truly faded. Giuseppe Verdi, the composer who became the heartbeat of Italian opera, was born on October 10th, 1813, in the small village of Laroncal near Busseto, in what was then part of the French Empire. His family, though modest, was deeply connected to the rhythms of life. His father, an innkeeper, and his mother, a spinner, could never have imagined the monumental legacy their son would leave behind. From a young age, Verdi showed an extraordinary musical gift. He played the organ at his local church, and it was clear that music ran in his veins. When Verdi was just a boy, a wealthy patron, Antonio Barezzi, recognized his brilliance and supported him in his studies. The young Verdi moved to Milan, where he immersed himself in opera and culture. Despite being rejected by the Milan Conservatory, Verdi didn't give up. He studied privately, listened obsessively, and began composing with a burning passion. His early works showed a composer on fire with creativity, ready to transform the world. His breakthrough came in 1839 when his first opera, Oberto, premiered in Milan to great success. But as his star began to rise, life threw a cruel blow. In the span of just 2 years, Verdi lost his wife, Margherita, and their 2 young children. Crushed by grief, he vowed never to compose again. It seemed as though the music had died inside him. But fate and a powerful libretto had other plans. In 1842, Verdi was handed a script for Nabucco, an opera about the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. Initially reluctant, he poured his soul into the composition. The result was a thunderous triumph. The opera's famous chorus, Va Pensiero, became a symbol of the longing for freedom. It resonated so deeply with Italians living under foreign rule that it became an unofficial anthem for the movement toward Italian unification. Verdi was back, and Italy had found its voice. From then on, Verdi composed as if possessed by the spirit of revolution. Nabucco, Macbeth, Lewis Miller, and Il Trovatore. Each opera was a potent mix of passion, patriotism, and heartbreaking drama, reflecting Italy's struggle for independence. Verdi's name became more than just a composer's. It became a rallying cry for the people. Viva Verdi was written on walls, an acronym for Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, supporting the future king of a unified Italy. Verdi had become the voice of the nation. But beneath this political movement, he remained an artist of exquisite sensitivity. His music didn't just accompany the drama, it was the drama itself. Then came his masterpieces. In 1851, Rigoletto captivated audiences with its tale of a cursed court jester, whose tragic fate unfolded with devastating precision. In 1853, he premiered Il Trovatore, a story of mistaken identities, burning revenge, and an impossible love. That same year, La Traviata debuted, the story of Violetta, the courtesan with a golden heart, is as tender as it is heart-wrenching. The opera's beauty left audiences weeping, and critics in awe. Verdi had ascended to the pinnacle of opera, not just as a composer, but as a storyteller who could move mountains with his music. Despite his fame, Verdi never lost his humble roots. He bought land near his hometown, where he farmed and spent quiet evenings away from the glittering salons of the elite. He married Giuseppina Strepponi, a soprano who had championed his work early on. Their bond was deep and unwavering. It seemed that Verdi, after conquering the opera world, had retired from public life. But in his 70s, when people thought he had said everything he needed to say, Verdi surprised the world again. He returned with Don Carlo, Ada, and Requiem, works that stunned with their grandeur and intimacy. Ada, composed for the opening of the Cairo Opera House in 1871, was a masterpiece filled with love and betrayal set against the backdrop of the pyramids. But Verdi wasn't done. In his 70s, he composed two more operatic miracles, Otello in 1887 and Falstaff in 1893. Otello, based on Shakespeare's tragedy, was fiery and tragic, while Falstaff was light, filled with wit and humor. The final note of Falstaff, a jubilant fugue, declared that tutto nel mondo e grave burla, everything in the world is a joke, a perfect, playful farewell to the stage. But in January 1901, while staying at the Grand Hotel in Milan, Verdi suffered a stroke. The entire city fell silent as the great composer lay dying. Trams stopped, streets emptied. The whole of Italy mourned the loss of its beloved voice. On January 27, 1901, Giuseppe Verdi passed away at the age of 87. Over 200,000 mourners lined the streets of Milan for his funeral. At his request, the chorus of Va Pensiero was sung softly by the crowd, a final tribute to the man who had given Italy its musical voice. Verdi had given the world music of fire, tenderness, grief, and grandeur. He had woven the struggles and passions of an entire nation into his operas, and his music became a mirror to the hopes and dreams of his people. Today, when a soprano raises her voice in La Traviata, or a baritone growls in Rigoletto, Verdi's spirit still lives on. And as you drift into dreams, imagine the hush before an aria, the flicker of candlelight in a gilded theater, and the sound of a single voice, breaking your heart in the most beautiful way. Dmitri Dmitrievich Shostakovich was born on September 25, 1906, in St. Petersburg, Russia, a child of a world on the brink of transformation. His life would unfold in the shadows of history's most tumultuous century. His father was a scientist and statistician, his mother a pianist who first introduced him to the keys. Little Dmitri was a serious, thin boy with a talent that quickly became impossible to ignore. By the age of 13, he entered the Petrograd Conservatory, a sanctuary of notes and discipline, where he absorbed the world of music like a sponge. His talent was undeniable, a memory like a steel trap, a technique sharp enough to astonish his teachers. He could play entire symphonies by ear, and he composed with a brilliance beyond his years. At 19, his first symphony burst onto the scene, a triumph of energy and wit, and Dmitri became the Soviet Union's rising star. But Shostakovich's brilliance bloomed in dangerous soil. The Soviet Union under Stalin was a place where art was not just art. It was a weapon, a tool, a performance of loyalty. In 1934, his opera Lady Macbeth of Emtsensk premiered. It was wild, raw, filled with passion and violence. Audiences loved it, but then Stalin attended a performance. Days later, an article appeared in the state newspaper Pravda. Muddle instead of music, it declared. Shostakovich's world cracked. His phone rang with silence. Friends vanished. He began sleeping with a packed suitcase by the door, expecting the knock that could mean death. But he didn't stop. No, he found a way to speak in whispers, to say everything without saying it. In 1937, his Fifth Symphony premiered. Officially, it was a Soviet artist's creative response to justified criticism. In truth, it was a masterpiece of double meaning, a triumphant finale that some heard as glory, others as forced celebration, a cry of suffering hidden beneath the roar. Then came the war, the siege of Leningrad, a city starved, bombed, frozen. Shostakovich stayed, composing in a besieged city, firelight dancing on the manuscript of his Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony. It was performed even as the city's people fought to survive, and it became a symbol of resistance, a sound of defiance that echoed around the world. But after the war, the darkness returned. In 1948, Shostakovich was denounced again, his music condemned as formalistic. Publicly, he apologized. Privately, he kept writing, hiding his soul in chamber works like his Eighth String Quartet. It was an autobiography in notes, filled with his musical initials, DSCH, a silent scream in the language only he could write. As he aged, his hair gray and his body frail, Shostakovich became a man divided. He joined the Communist Party under pressure, appeared at state ceremonies, smiled for the cameras. But his music never lied. His later symphonies, his string quartets, they were meditations on suffering, on memory, on death. He died on August 9th, 1975, in Moscow. His funeral was modest, but his legacy was monumental. Shostakovich lived with fear, but he never lost his voice. In his music, irony and honesty danced, suffering sang, and truth whispered beneath the roar. Tonight, close your eyes and listen. Hear the tension beneath the triumph, the whisper beneath the shout, the beating heart of a man who spoke in shadows and found light in sound. In the summer air of a small coastal town near St. Petersburg, a voice echoed through the halls of a modest home. It was the powerful bass of Fyodor Stravinsky, a celebrated opera singer with the Imperial Opera, filling the rooms with the thunder of Russian arias. Beside him, a young boy listened, wide-eyed, his soul already dancing to the invisible rhythms that seemed to weave through the air. This boy was Igor Fyodorovich Stravinsky, born on June 17, 1882. From the beginning, music was both a whisper and a roar in his life. His mother, a talented pianist, would fill their home with the gentle cascades of piano notes, while his father's commanding voice showed him the raw force of sound. Yet, despite this musical upbringing, his parents had a different path in mind for him. Law, a profession respectable, stable, and so young Igor dutifully enrolled in law school at St. Petersburg University. But while his professors spoke of statutes and precedents, his heart wandered to melodies and rhythms. Secretly, he sought the guidance of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, a master composer and a storyteller through sound. Rimsky-Korsakov, with his silver beard and sparkling eyes, saw in young Stravinsky a spark waiting to ignite. Under his mentorship, Igor learned the mysteries of orchestration, the art of painting emotions with instruments, and the magic of transforming folklore into symphonic drama. It was in 1909 that fate came knocking, carried by the flamboyant impresario Sergei Diaghilov. Diaghilov's Ballets Russes, a daring dance company, had taken Paris by storm with its avant-garde performances. Sensing something exceptional in the young Stravinsky, Diaghilov commissioned him to create a ballet. Igor, with a mix of fear and fire, embraced the challenge. The result was The Firebird in 1910. The premiere was like a thunderclap. The audience gasped, their eyes wide with wonder as the stage came alive with glowing colors, ethereal dances, and Stravinsky's bold, lush music. Paris had never heard anything like it. But for Igor, this was just the beginning. 3 years later, he would unleash the Rite of Spring, a work that would shake the world. It was a ballet about ancient, primal rituals, where a young girl dances herself to death as a sacrifice. The music was wild, rhythmic, raw. a savage heartbeat pulsing with life. When it premiered in 1913, the theater erupted into chaos. Some shouted in awe, others in outrage. Fists flew. The press declared it a scandal. Stravinsky had sparked a riot, but also a revolution. World War I shattered the peace of Europe. And Stravinsky, like so many, became a wanderer. He left Russia, never to return permanently. Switzerland became a temporary haven, then France, and finally the United States. But no matter where he went, his music remained a restless traveler, forever exploring. In France, he embraced a new style, neoclassicism. His music became crisp, clear, and precise, like a masterful sketch. His works like Pulcinella and the Symphony of Psalms reflected this fresh, refined voice. Yet he was never static, always evolving. When the shadow of another world war loomed, he moved to Los Angeles, the land of palm trees and Hollywood stars. There he taught at universities, composed film scores, and mingled with cultural giants like Aldous Huxley and Charlie Chaplin. Despite the sunshine, he remained a complex, sometimes prickly figure, his humor sharp and his music always challenging, never settling. As time passed, even in his old age, Stravinsky refused to become a relic. He dived headfirst into the world of serialism, a style of composition as precise as mathematics, yet capable of strange beauty. Guided by his young collaborator Robert Kraft, he explored this new realm with the same fearless curiosity that had defined his youth. Stravinsky passed away on April 6, 1971, in New York City. His body was laid to rest in Venice, on the island of San Michele, close to the grave of his old friend Sergei Diaghilev. It was a fitting end for a man whose music had crossed continents, shattered conventions, and set the world on fire. Igor Stravinsky was more than a composer. He was a force of nature, a master of rhythm, a poet of chaos, and a magician of sound. His music does not merely ask to be heard, it demands to be felt. And even now, his wild rhythms and primal dances continue to echo, a fire that will never be extinguished.